Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast, dedicated to the Holy Family. I'm Thomas V. Mirus. Today I'm talking to CatholicCulture.org founder Jeff Mirus about his experience founding and operating several different Catholic apostolates. Hey everyone, I'm sure today's guest will be familiar to many of you, Dr. Jeff Mirus. He is the founder of CatholicCulture.org and writes commentary there several times a week, and he is my dad. This being the Catholic Culture Podcast, after all, it was only a matter of time before I was going to have him on the show, but I thought it would be cool to have him on specifically to talk about the ins and outs of running a Catholic institutional apostolate. For those of you who may feel called to start some kind of apostolate on your own, or find yourself in the position of administrating one, even if it's not one you yourself started, I think you're going to find a lot of value in this episode. Now, what I've done is divided this interview into two episodes. So in part one, which you're hearing today, we start by giving some context about the state of the Catholic Church when my dad was coming of age, his early sense of a calling to work in apologetics, his formative intellectual influences, and then we go into his founding of the interdisciplinary academic journal he founded in 1975, Faith and Reason, and we talk about his experience co-founding a Catholic college, namely Christendom College in Virginia. And throughout all these experiences, we talk about the unique problems that one faces in running an institutional apostolate of any kind, what he calls the situational problems, the practical problems, and the personal problems. Anything from how to keep your organization faithful to its Catholic mission while having an independent board of directors, to how to discern God's will for your institution, to the importance of keeping faith with your audience. Then in the second part of the interview, which will be released in an upcoming episode, we bring things up to date with his founding of Trinity Communications, which was originally a publishing company and then became an online apostolate, ultimately reaching its present form in CatholicCulture.org. So here's part one of my interview with Dr. Jeff Mirus. All right, Dad, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Thanks. It's exciting for me to be on your very own podcast show. Although I have to say that one should never want to be interviewed by one of his children. I'd like to present myself in the best and most favorable light here. And it's going to be difficult if I hear you snickering in the background when I say good things about myself. So
Okay.
We'll see how it goes.
All right. I wonder if you could tell our listeners a little bit about your Catholic upbringing and what the church was like when you were in your teens, say.
Sure. I was raised by a Catholic mother and a father who was, I suppose nominally Protestant, but really didn't evince any religious faith at all. But my mom did her best to raise her children Catholic in accordance with, the church's requirements for mixed marriages at that time, and she certainly was a strong believer herself. But I did not go to Catholic schools, so I was educated in the public schools. And I did have, from a very young period, I don't know why, I suppose it's a grace, already the intimation of a calling, a strong interest in Catholic faith and morals. So I was the kid who would, if one of my friends stole a candy bar from the local drugstore, would have a long talk with him and get him to go back to the store, return the candy, and or pay for it, and confess his wrongdoing. Or I was always debating with my Protestant friends the teachings of their church versus the teachings of the Catholic Church. So there was some kind of interest in Catholic faith and morals at a very early period, but in that period it was more of a Catholic versus Protestant issue. The secularization of the culture, although that's been ongoing for half a millennium, hadn't really hit grade school kids or even high school kids that much yet. there was a sense that most of us were either Catholic or Protestant, and we were supposed to be
and
Catholic
this would be
or
in the
Protestant.
50s, right?
In the 50s. I was born in 48, so I was 12 in 1960. I went to high school in 1962.
So just to go back a little bit, you didn't go to Catholic school. So where would your Catholic education, did you go to Sunday school or something like that?
Yes, I went to CCD, and the CCD program in our parish was reasonably decent. But I don't know, how, for example, you as a musician, whenever you learn anything about music, you just never forget it. And for some reason, I was like a sponge. Even when I was not in a thorough Catholic environment, I was a sponge for any Catholic ideas, and they just almost automatically ordered themselves methodically in my mind.
So were you reading anything like as a teenager? Had you started reading any Catholic authors? Had you started gravitating towards scholarship in particular, aside from your sort of debates with your friends and things like that?
No, not yet. I had read some Lives of the Saints because we had a few books like that lying around the house from an early age. But no, it's actually a kind of a mystery to me as I look back. I'm not sure where all this came from in terms of the authority of the Pope and why the Pope was important, or why my Protestant friends didn't have the sacrament of penance, or why they didn't have the Eucharist. I don't really remember where that came from.
But you were thinking about that stuff.
Yes.
Oh, very interesting. So you're heading to college, and is there anything in particular that you're planning on studying? Were you always planning on studying history?
No, actually, when I was in high school, I already had some kind of a vague intimation that I wanted to, help people in how they perceive and think about things, but it wasn't a sense of a specific religious vocation or job. So I was thinking of being a psychologist when I graduated from high school, because that connected with me as a way in the modern world to straighten people out, I guess you might say. That idea didn't last too long. Once I got to college, things shifted a bit.
So you're in college and you're at Rutgers, and you're sort of becoming aware at this point of the situation and the changes in the wider world. And particularly you are starting, when do you go to college? 1966?
Yes, 1966. That's right.
Okay, so you went to college in 1966.
And first I went to someplace where I got a scholarship, which was a Quaker-affiliated school in Wilmington, Ohio, called Wilmington College. And there, everybody was left-wing, and nobody had anything more than a Quaker outlook on faith. But
that's interesting.
The student body was already very radicalized, and I was immediately getting in arguments about whether or not easy divorce was a good thing, and the political front, whether or not the Vietnam War was a good thing, of course. And the school newspaper was, very secular and very left. So I and a roommate of mine who was fairly influential and was, I think, a year ahead of me, started a counter newspaper there, which we called Excalibur.
That sounds like every prominent conservative who went to, a secular university. It seems like all of them started a counter newspaper at some point.
I think it was a natural reflex. And the year after that, I got my awakening in terms of the problems in the church that year.
Yeah, had you had any sense that it was going to be like this when you went to college?
No, I hadn't really thought about that. When I was in high school, the senior year, the pastor taught what was called the Social Christianity CCD program. And he spent the year telling us what we should expect when we went off to college in terms of all the faulty ideas and faulty values that would be taught to us and that we would encounter. It was just head knowledge when I was getting it, because that wasn't the community I was in as a high schooler. But as soon as I got there, everything he said proved to be true. And I regarded him as a prophet. That had a profound influence on me. And it was then that I also, in light of that I started reading. Well, I read the Wanderer newspaper, which was a prominent conservative Catholic weekly newspaper, and started learning about the fact that this crisis was not just in the larger society. It had actually entered the church itself in terms of not thinking in a spiritual way, not having faith, simply having a secular outlook on life.
So this is the point where you're starting to get an intellectual perspective on these things rather than sort of instinctually responding to situation as you enter them. So who are you reading at this time? Like, what Catholic writers are you being influenced by?
I was probably being mostly influenced by the few remaining Orthodox Catholic papers and magazines. As I said, it was The Wanderer in my freshman year. A little later, it was Triumph magazine, which was actually started in 1965, but I didn't discover it right away, which was considerably more sophisticated intellectually. And I also read the Bible straight through for the first time in my freshman year. And I also I had one particular insight about the crisis in the church, because I was reading more and more about how so many priests were leaving the priesthood, and so many Catholic outlets, most of the Catholic magazines, newspapers, and publishing companies went bad theologically almost overnight, publishing heretical authors that denied previously defined truths of the faith. And I remember pondering this problem of priests, so many priests. The exodus from the priesthood was just amazing, so much so that Paul VI had to streamline the process. And I remember reading about one of the early ones who left, an English priest named Charles Davis, who gave an interview about it. And in the interview, he admitted that he had stopped praying long before he left the priesthood. Many people have now, for a priest to stop praying is not exactly to live the Catholic life prescriptively, because one of the prescriptions for a priest is to say the divine office, but it does tie in with a common complaint that in the 50s, Catholics tended to live the faith prescriptively. I can remember as a boy, saying things like, all I want to know is what I need to do to get into purgatory. What are my obligations? The idea of an interior life didn't occur to me, right away when I was thinking about Catholic things. My prayer life didn't blossom while I was having my debates with my friends until I got to college, and then it began to. But what Charles Davis had said about himself, I realized that was the root of a great deal. Many people had just been, doing their jobs within the church. The culture around them shifted. It was no longer popular to be religious. Everything secularized very rapidly when the culture shifted kind of institutionally or outside. I mean, people didn't have a lot of faith in the 20th century in many ways anyway, but it was expected that people would go to church. It was expected that people would, pay tribute to the conventional pieties and have a proper sexual morality and all that. Well, all that blew up in the 60s. That was just.
And this was a time when the Catholic Church had a lot more influence in the country than it did, say, in the 19th century, I would suppose.
Oh, absolutely. But it was a situation in which there was a shell of kind of respectability, which was utterly shattered in the kind of semi-revolutionary attitudes of the 60s. And so almost overnight, all the Catholic intellectuals who were hiding in Catholic universities and who were really modernists but had been kind of suppressed and weren't publishing freely up through the 50s ended up coming out of the woodwork and saying what they really thought. The seminary teachers felt free to give vent to attitudes that were popular throughout the culture. There was the veneer, the shell dropped away, and there was nothing in the larger culture and very little in the church that held it up anymore or sustained it. And consequently, you had this lack of spirituality, this lack of deep prayer, which reflected itself in an imitation of the larger culture.
So we've talked about the situation in the church to a degree. What was the environment like academically for you once you got to Rutgers? Were you benefiting a lot from serious thinkers that you encountered at that school, secular thinkers, I should say?
No, probably not. Sophomore year, I went to the seminary in Buffalo, New York for a year and tried that, but I decided I didn't have a priestly vocation. But one thing I had learned was that we also were living in a culture of expertise. In other words, you ask yourself the question, how do you overcome? How do you counter those people who are saying, and a lot of them were parents, who are saying, what you're teaching my kid is all wrong. This is not the truth. Why are you changing the rules on us? And the response in the culture of the 60s and even the early 70s was, well, because we have expertise. We have theological expertise, or we have scientific expertise. So you're just a parent. You don't have the education. You're just a poor sister. You don't have the education. So be guided by those of us who are experts. So I determined after I left the seminary that I was going to become highly credentialed as a way of at least getting in the door to having my voice heard and not just being utterly dismissed. And moreover, I was going to select a field, which wasn't necessarily my favorite field, but it was a kind of a universal field, the field of history, so that almost any intellectual discussion that came up, I could claim as an intellectual historian, which is what I actually became. I could claim to have some expertise in the roots of those ideas and get in on the discussion. I did have one professor at Rutgers who was actually Jewish, but he was very attuned to the Jewish mystical tradition. And even though he wasn't much of a practicing Jew, he was always interested in that. So he always encouraged my spiritual interests and gave me, helped me with to do projects there, which were in my interest without poo-pooing them, like studying Savonarola for my senior project, and then gave me, of course, good recommendation for graduate school because I decided to go to Princeton because, again, I wanted to have high credentials. So that was a tactical plan. And I figured that I was going to teach or write, and that's how I would address the problems in the church and the culture, since I decided that I was not sacramentally inclined. In other words, I realized in my sophomore year that if I wasn't really interested in administering the sacraments as a primary means of sanctifying people, then I wasn't called to be a priest.
That's interesting. That's kind of exactly the same thought process that I went to. Mm-hmm. It's like I could imagine myself preaching, but I could never imagine myself giving the sacraments.
Exactly.
You have a couple of funny stories from when you were at Rutgers in particular about sort of the cultural revolution that was happening at the time. Can you share some of those?
Well, there are stories of two kinds. One, which you actually may not know, I don't know if you've heard this, unlike one of the other ones, but one was, apparently I was the most loudmouth, religiously oriented person on campus, because when it came time for Rutgers to recommend someone for the Danforth, to compete for the Danforth Fellowship, which was a fellowship that was interested in students who were bringing religion to bear on the problems of life, they called me in and said, look, you're our guy, so you need to go get interviewed as part of the Danforth process and see if you can get this fellowship. So I went into New York City when my interview was scheduled, and the interviewer was asking me all kinds of questions, found out I was a Catholic, probed my views on being a Catholic, and asked me about what were my views on the situation in the church today. And so, all innocence, I said, there's kind of a counter-magisterium in the church today. The Pope says one thing, but the theologians and the academics say something else. And in fact, in the United States, there is a group of 6 or 7 formally authentically Catholic journals like Commonweal, Jubilee, Cross Currents, America, some of which are around today, most of which are not, which kind of communicate with each other and make sure that they take the same positions on everything and publish articles, only articles that on sensitive questions like contraception and things like that, which advocate a change in church teaching that's really impossible, which don't accept the faith. And the guy, recall that I said Jubilee and Cross Currents were 2 of these magazines. I can't remember which one my interviewer edited, but he announced that he was the editor of one of these magazines, brought the interview to a quick close, and walked out the door. And that was the end of my Danforth fellowship.
Wow. Yeah, I don't think I've never heard that one before. That's great.
But the other one that you may be referring to is the Black students on campus, since this was kind of the anti-Vietnam War and anti-racial prejudice, which is certainly a good thing, period, they were up in arms because it had been rumored to them that Young Americans for Freedom, a conservative organization of college students around the country, had, I forget exactly what they'd been told, but had been, bad-mouthing them, writing graffiti against blacks and things like this. And they were having a mass meeting to figure out what to do about this. Well, I was the head of our local Young Americans for Freedom chapter, and actually had it on pretty good authority that the left-wing organization, Students for a Democratic Society, had actually done these things and spread the rumor that it was Young Americans for Freedom who had done them, just to precipitate conflict. So I went over to where the black students were meeting, and it was in the kind of reception area, which was the bottom floor of one of the major dorms on campus. I walked into this crowd of easily 100 or more black guys in their very late teens and early 20s, and tried to find somebody who was a leader to talk to them about these rumors and to assure them that they weren't true, that there was nothing even remotely connected to racial prejudice in the conservative sympathies of Young Americans for Freedom. And so all the time I'm talking to this guy, there's this other black kid who's blowing smoke in my face, and there are a bunch of people gathered around with angry scowls. And I realized, belatedly, that I was not in a good situation. Fortunately, I didn't blow my cool, and finally I thought the conversation had gone far enough that I asked the leadership type guy to say if he could get his friend to stop blowing smoke in my face. And shortly after, I made my way out with a very, very gingerly slipping between people, not bumping anybody too hard in the crowd, and I was allowed to escape.
Well, you had the sort of, in your senior year, you had the situation with student, what would you call them, sit-ins on college campuses all across the country?
Yeah. When the Vietnam War ended and the draft lottery came into effect, they weren't having the traditional draft. They now gave everybody a lottery number, and they took as many numbers as they needed to fill up the ranks. And I remember everybody was glued to their radio on the night the lottery assignment of numbers was announced. And I came in at number 10. I was a little late getting to the radio and listened to numbers 10 through 365. So what happened was I listened all the way through number 365, and my number wasn't called. And of course, I was very happy, when I was in the 300s and my number hadn't been called yet, because I figured I was home free. I wasn't so happy when they got the number 365, and my number hadn't been assigned to me yet, and I realized that I had missed the first 10 numbers. So I found out I was number 4. So I looked around for a National Guard unit to join, and I was able to join a National Guard unit, which assured me that I'd be able, this was my senior year. I had about 6 months left of school, and I wanted to finish school and get my degree, and they said that'd be no problem. They wouldn't send me for training until after I graduated. But of course, graduation was in May. They sent me for training in March. I made arrangements with my professors to do my work, to finish my courses from basic training. That was one thing everybody was sympathetic to. Nobody liked the military, so, in academia at that time. So they were more than happy to have me work in my spare time during basic training and advanced training to finish up the coursework, which I did. I even took my final exams by mail, finished it all up, sent my final exams in. As you alluded to, there had been a sit-in at Rutgers over some controversy between the students' administration, which had caused exams to be canceled. To the best of my knowledge, I was the only student at Rutgers that took final exams in 1970.
So now you're moving on to Princeton. And was there anybody in particular that you had wanted to study history there at Princeton?
Yeah, there was a rather sympathetic professor who was an expert in Renaissance history, Felix Gilbert, who was at the Institute for Advanced Study, which is in Princeton, along with Princeton University. And he was happy. We had a lot of interests in common, including some religious interests. And so he was my advisor because the normal Renaissance history professor, which was the field I was interested in, Renaissance and Reformation history, because I really wanted to study that period and then what followed in terms of the transformation of Western culture and ultimate secularization. The man on the Princeton faculty was on sabbatical my first year, so I was able to choose this guy, Felix Gilbert, at the Institute for Advanced Study. So that was very good for me. Now, the man who, when he came back, who was the main professor in Renaissance history at Princeton, was actually shifting into 19th century history anyway. I had one class with him in which he wanted to present a new thesis he had come up with and written in a paper, which he was submitting to an academic journal, in which he argued that the explanation for the mystical experiences that medieval and early modern saints had, especially religious in their convents or monasteries or hermits, could be explained by the fact they fasted so intensely that they hallucinated. And it was funny.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah, now it was strange because at the time I wasn't knowledgeable enough to give a good historically based critique of that. I talked to him afterwards and I said, I don't know that that's a more sensible explanation unless you rule out a priori that if you say, in a prejudgment that mystical experience is impossible, because otherwise how do you respect history and come up with an explanation that's dramatically different from how people perceive the experience themselves? But I later learned that St. Teresa of Avila, in her advice to nuns, talks about situations. She was, of course, a great mystic. She talks about situations in which nuns, her sisters, engaged in way too much penance and ate way too little and fell into faints and swoons and imagined all kinds of things, and she had to order them to eat more and sleep more. So, in other words, if he had done any reading in this field of spiritual writing and spiritual experience at all from that period, he would have known that these people knew the difference between an hallucination and a genuine mystical experience. So that's typical of the university at the time.
Yeah, at least she knew the difference.
Well, she knew the difference, and a lot of other people would have been asking that too. In other words, if you went to your spiritual director and said, I'm having visions and God's telling me things to do, believe me, they were very slow to take you at your word, as a general rule. So Princeton was a very secular environment, but I was getting my credentials, and I was all the time reading more and more books in the course of my studies that touched on religious issues, because the shifts in religion played a very important part in Renaissance and Reformation history, which was my primary field. Also in early modern English history with the English Revolution. And of course, then that was one of my minor fields, and my other minor field was medieval history. So I was trying to get at that transition, particularly with respect to intellectual history, to see what was happening, from the late medieval period on through, say, the 17th century. What was happening to the way people thought about reality and why, which I wanted to have down pat as a way of interpreting or reinterpreting modern experience and how people reacted to it.
So who are some of the major people that you're reading who are formative intellectual influences on you at your time at Princeton?
Actually, one of the most important books that I ever read was a biography by Sigrid Undset of St. Catherine of Siena. Sigrid Undset was also a novelist who wrote, great novels that had a strong Catholic core, like The Master of Hestviken and Kristin Lavransdatter, among other things. But she has a nice biography of St. Catherine of Siena, and I did a major research paper on St. Catherine, learned a lot about her spirituality and what she was trying to do to get the popes to return to Rome from Avignon. And of course, she was a mystic. And I will never forget, in fact, one of the things that she complained about in her own writings, which was when she was praying intensely and she was being extraordinarily strongly afflicted, at least in her experience, with temptations to impurity. And this went on for a long, long time, hours. And however, she continued to try to pray. And it was a relatively dry spell for her. She didn't have the sense of Christ's presence. But then when he kind of came to her again and started speaking to her in her soul again, after the kind of the crisis had passed, she said, "Lord, where were you? You weren't with me when I was undergoing these tremendous temptations." And he said, I almost cry every time I recount this story, but anyway, he said, "Daughter, I was with you. If I had not been with you, you would have fallen." And that had a huge, huge impact on me. Another thinker was St. Augustine, who I actually had read at Rutgers. I was assigned him in a course, the Confessions, and I refused to read it on schedule. I was so taken with it. I read it for spiritual reading slowly, just a little bit each night. It was mostly getting into the primary sources, which you can do in graduate school, where you're researching something, but it's always good to go to primary sources. And if you're in intellectual history, that means you're going to the writings of people, not economic data taken from ledgers or something like that. So in addition to reading great historians like Christopher Dawson, who had been way and well before me in charting the formation and the disintegration of Christian culture over the centuries, I did read writings by a large number of saints. And in my dissertation, which was on the connection between Catholic reform and the defense of the papacy, because it was the Dominicans who renewed their order in what was called the observant reform. It was the Dominicans who renewed the order that defended the papacy, and those who had fallen away from the rule really accomplished nothing. So I was interested in that connection, and so I also read the works of a significant number of Dominican priests who were theologians, and who wrote on both reform and on the defense of the papacy. So there was a formation there of sorts, an important formation.
Okay, so you're coming out of Princeton in the early to mid 70s, and you're getting a sense that you have a vocation to some kind of Catholic apostolate. Now, I'm wondering, was there really such a thing as lay apologetics or a lay apostolate at this time?
There was starting to be. I benefited from a group of Catholics United, called Catholics United for the Faith, which is a group of lay people. They'd form little chapters in different communities where mostly ordinary family people would be getting together to try to support each other, because they were hearing so much nonsense from their priests, and they were trying to preserve the faith in their own families and work and grope their way toward a program of renewal. And Catholics United for the Faith was also influenced strongly by some very intellectual members who would circulate ideas and recommendations and so on to the chapters from the central office, which I believe was in New Rochelle, New York. So that was going on there, and there were a few other things. There weren't great many other things, but that was about to change very rapidly. Once the 60s were over and we got to the mid-70s, then apostolates of various kinds new colleges, new publishing ventures, and so on, started springing up around the United States, spearheaded primarily by lay people, though one great exception to that is the work that Father Joseph Fessio did, both at the San Francisco Institute, if that's what it was called, where he had a special program of studies, and with the founding of Ignatius Press. But even he relied mostly on lay people for the work that he did, but he definitely guided it. He is a Jesuit, of course.
So was there a sense at this point that the clergy were not really holding up their end, so the lay people had to sort of take up their tools?
Yes, this is exactly what happened in the years following the Second Vatican Council, although nobody could have predicted it, and nobody did predict it at the council. You had the council write a document for the first time in the history of the church on, really describing the role of the laity and the baptismal identity of the laity and their vocations as priest, prophet, and king. Priestly, different from the special priesthood of the ordained, obviously, but still responsibility for their own spiritual life, responsibility for advancing the faith, and of course responsibility for works of love and charity, so that everything did not, education. The council made it very clear that these things didn't all need to be run by clergy, which was the common, when there were plenty of clergy, that was often what was done. So the laity was kind of a sleeping giant, although it was getting washed away very quickly. As well as the culture shifted, it was not at the mercy of theological trends in the seminaries so much. So the fulfillment of Vatican II came in a way nobody expected, and that is because the clergy defaulted, literally a massive default of clergy and religious as seminaries, bishops, seminaries, and religious communities were all washed away by the secularist tide, which usually took the form of modernism in religious terms. And the laity were left with no choice but to pick up the ball and run with it. And they threw themselves into all kinds of activities to try to get the word out in terms of what was solid Catholic doctrine and what wasn't. And then from the mid-70s on, that just exploded until today. We have a situation in which it's mostly apostolates founded by lay people that are providing solid resources to parishes now. For example, the Augustine Institute. It's mostly organizations founded by laity that are sending missionaries onto college campuses around the country. I think in terms of focus, those are just two outstanding, of the most outstanding successful apostolates that were founded by lay people. That has become the pattern in the church, in the apostolate, that there's a shortage of priests now, of course, so it's very important that even the best ones primarily concentrate on sacramental part of their ministry and on spiritual direction. That's critical, but it's mostly the laity that are in charge of all these other things that aren't directly ecclesiastical.
So are you pretty much thinking at this point that you are going to be working in apologetics specifically?
Yeah, I would say that that's true. Apologetics was...
And that includes defending the church from enemies from within as much as from without, perhaps even more from within at this point, right?
Exactly. It was apologetics primarily directed within, and with a great interest on my part in how we got to where we are in terms of the secularization of the culture and the secularization within the church, and how the mindset had to change, and why it was important, why it was good, and why it was consistent with what our Lord had revealed, that mentality had to change, and that the attitudes that were being advertised as the new paradigm, and still are being advertised as the new paradigm, were simply not Catholic. So yes, I devoted myself to that, and I decided I would be teaching and writing. And when I got my first college job, the first thing I did was set up an academic interdisciplinary journal where we would write about things, publish things of interest to academics who were faithfully Catholic, because the journals had mostly gone by the boards too, in terms of being willing to entertain articles that defended or did real theology with respect to key Catholic questions, rather than just reflecting the biases of the modern world and trying to curry favor in the larger secular society. So I started a journal called Faith and Reason, which lasted, later went on to become I made it the Journal of Christendom College when I helped to found Christendom. But that was the first.
Was this before had the encyclical come out called Faith and Reason yet, or was this before that?
That was way before. Yeah, it was 1975.
Oh, interesting.
So John Paul II hadn't even been elected Pope yet. That would come in 78.
Okay. So what's the process for founding a journal like this?
Well, I like to consider, three kinds of problems. Anytime somebody wants to do an institutional apostolate, in fact, let me make a distinction here, as we're going to get into some of the things that I founded. Every Catholic, every Christian is called to apostolate by virtue of our baptism. I think that's pretty well understood nowadays, at least, among the kind of people who would be listening to this podcast. But we're not all called to what I call a formal or institutional apostolate. Most of us in the context of the ways we make our living and our family lives, the nature of our family lives. Find ways directed toward the family or directed toward the community to participate in works that help others spiritually or help them materially in a distinctive Catholic way which reflects an appreciation for the whole person. But some people, and I've always felt like I was one of them, are called to do apostolic work full time. One way to do that is to be a priest, and then you get your living from the church. But if you're a layman, you need then to find a way to support it. So the first two things that you need if you're going to be in the lay apostolate full time, and this is true partly, the first one's true of any apostolic work. The first thing you need is to solve the situational problem. So the three sets of problems that have to be solved in the apostolate. The situational problem is a right reading of the situation that needs to be corrected or needs to be improved or needs to have the light of Christ and the faith of the church shown upon it. So there's a situational problem. Now, we've been talking about the situational problem throughout with the secularization of the church, of the culture, which profoundly caused a movement of secularization in the church and therefore caused the crisis of faith within the church itself. So I think, we've had the right reading on the nature of the problem. I don't think anybody who's listening would disagree with that. But then there's the question, so now I'm founding an academic journal. How is that going to be supported? Where is it going to get the wherewithal to keep going? And because I had already been writing for The Wanderer as a student, and then later for Triumph magazine as a student, I actually, by time I got to my first college teaching position, I was actually known to some degree throughout the active Orthodox Catholic community. And so I could take out a few advertisements here and there in these publications and get people to be excited about Faith and Reason, primitive as it was in its early editions, and subscribe to it. At the same time, I was a college teacher, and the one thing about college teachers is they don't work very hard. I mean, if you're a good teacher and you really care about your research and being the best intellectual you can be, and you're given intellectual opportunities at the university you teach at, it can be a demanding work, but you don't have a heavy teaching load in terms of hours. You don't have to be nose to the grindstone with somebody looking over your shoulder like you do in an office job or something like that, or even a high school teaching job where you're in school all day and correcting papers at night. So,
where were you teaching at this time?
My first job was at a campus of the North Carolina University system.
Okay.
So I had a fairly easy job in terms of being able to do intellectual things that were not required directly of me by the university. So between my time and my family size, which only one child. So again, I was able to take the time to typeset this thing myself, to see it through the press, before that to edit all the articles that were submitted from other scholars who got wind of the thing. And everybody, all good Orthodox Catholic scholars were looking for a place to publish. And I was able to also advertise good books in the journal, which people would buy through me. So I made a little bit there, and I was able to make it pay for itself. But the most important thing probably about the Faith and Reason effort was two things that I learned, or one thing that I learned and one thing that I gained. The thing that I learned something very important about keeping faith with your audience. As I said, we advertised books in the journal and people bought books. Well, one of the books I advertised after looking through it reasonably carefully was a book of questions and answers about the Catholic faith, which had a good reputation. And I advertised that, and some people bought it. And then I got a couple of letters that, this is before email, that the question on contraception in that book was faulty. I didn't realize that at some point in a new edition, that answer had been changed. And contraception was being justified despite the fact that in 1968, Pope Paul VI had stated definitively that contraception within marriage is intrinsically immoral. So I had a decision to make. I could say I'm sorry, or I could say I'm very sorry. Thank you for calling that to my attention. We're dropping the book. You can keep it or throw it away. Here's your money back. Now, I chose to do the latter. I don't want to say that I chose to do it because I hoped what would happen happened. I thought I was just going to have to take the hit because it was the right thing to do. But when word, for those that I did that with, and when word got around, I started getting a lot more donations. A lot of donations. Actually, I wasn't really soliciting donations primarily. I got a lot of donations. I hadn't formed a nonprofit corporation yet, but that was because, as people told me in letters, this is unheard of. I've complained, to a dozen publishers over the last few years that their materials are unorthodox. Now, I was not the publisher in this case. I was just a middleman. And all I ever got was the brush off. So people were astonished. So that was an important lesson to learn, to keep faith with your audience, which is, of course, exactly what the majority of Catholic intellectuals were not doing, even though they still claimed the right to have good, solid positions, teaching positions and writing positions at Catholic magazines, newspapers, and in Catholic universities. The other thing, if I just might go on for a moment longer on this question, the other thing was that while in the early years, first or second year of Faith and Reason's publication, a man named Warren Carroll submitted an article, and I published it. He is a Catholic historian. He had until recently been running the Christian Commonwealth Institute, summer institutes in El Escorial, Spain, that Triumph magazine sponsored. And they'd get, Catholics from around the United States and probably some from Europe to sign up for these courses, and they'd have a small faculty, including Warren, which, gave them an intense immersion in Catholic, thought about politics, Catholic faith, Catholic culture. But that was over. Triumph had folded in 1975, unfortunately because of the mental illness of the founder. And Warren was thinking about using his experience running the Christian Commonwealth Institute to start a new Catholic college in the United States.
I should probably ask, at this point, what's the state of Catholic colleges in the United States?
There were almost none that made sure that their faculty taught authentic Catholicism. Almost none. There were a few that were pretty good. The University of Dallas, for example, had already been kind of reclaimed and established as a sound Catholic institution in the 1950s with the help of the Bishop of Dallas, or maybe it's the Bishop of Dallas-Fort Worth, I forget. The Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas never got washed away, at least not completely. It was still fairly sound. Some of the Vincentian schools were too bad for a while. They were fading fast. But in general, Catholic schools, including several important departments, like the theology department at Catholic University, had bought in to the secularizing modernist tendencies of Catholic intellectual life. And there was almost no Orthodox college or university to which one could safely send one's children. And it was a tribute to how little most Catholics in the 50s and 60s parents knew about the faith and knew what would happen to their children when they went off to college, that they kept sending them to these Catholic institutions and they kept coming home no longer Catholic, which is a great tragedy, which it's still going on today, but it was just massive at that time because parents, all unknowing, sent their kids off to formerly fine schools and found out that they were now completely different, including schools that they had perhaps gone to a generation earlier. So that was all gone, just like all the publishers. Most of the publishers were all gone. So Warren wanted to found a new college, and that's why about the same time Thomas Aquinas College had been founded. I think it was just ahead of Christendom, of Warren's foundation. But in any case, just to back up a bit, Warren was broke, and he had written me a note after I accepted his article. He said, "Can you pay me something for it?" And I wrote back and said, here's $100. It's about all the money I had in the kitty. I said, but please don't tell anybody else, because most people are willing to write for free and we just don't have a budget. Well, he remembered that. And when he put the prospectus together for Christendom to pass around and get ideas on, he sent it to me as one person he wanted comments from. And I commented, and he liked the comments. So after we met and exchanged further ideas, he invited me to become one of a team of 5 people, including himself, that was going to become the founding faculty of Christendom College, which we opened in 1977. Now that was a much bigger challenge.
How did you make the decision to go do that with him? I mean, was there any hesitation on your part? Any considerations you had to make, or were you pretty much in once he asked you?
I was pretty much in, but if I'm honest, I was going to have to look for a job that year anyway. My Catholicism, including taking the anti-abortion side in public debates held before the students on campus, and my publishing of a Catholic academic journal, a secular, in the context of a secular university, had very quickly marked me out as someone who is unfit for the North Carolina system. I would, to remain after my third year, I would have had to have been given tenure. So I wasn't given tenure. So I had to look for a job. Human nature is so funny, because the day I knew I had made the decision before I was given notice, I had already made the decision to go with Warren and start this new college. It definitely appealed to what I wanted to do, and I was definitely young and thought I could do anything, and perhaps young and foolish about money. But I wanted to do it. I had decided to do it, and then when I was told that I wasn't going to have a job next year at the university anyway, I cried. I mean, that is so crazy.
Oh.
But
so because you were upset?
Not that I was upset that I had lost my job, but it hurt to be fired. And while, I cried for about 2 minutes, but no, it didn't profoundly bother me, but it was a letdown. Apparently I was not so obviously God's gift to the entire universe as I thought I was. So it was definitely a blow to the old ego. But that's why I say human nature is very funny, because I was already planning to leave. I had very little respect for the place where I was, but by God, I'll quit. You can't fire me.
Right. Yeah. It's like being broken up with when you are planning on breaking up with the person anyway, or
exactly,
or not being believed when you're lying.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. Okay, well, we'll move on to Christendom then, because I talked about the situational problem, which hasn't changed. I talked about the first practical problem of any apostolate, which is how are you going to sustain it financially? Where is the support going to come from, or the money going to come from? Because you're talking about something that you want to do full time. Now I wasn't doing Faith and Reason full time, but the college was going to be full time, and so it becomes very important to have a source of income that can sustain the work. And then the second practical problem is, how do you keep control of it? I was publishing Faith and Reason on my own dime, and with donations that I solicited, or some donations and sales, subscriptions that I made. I had absolute control over it. But colleges are made up of, founding faculty, administrators, and a board of directors. And so you had a lot of people involved. And not only that, anybody crazy enough to try to start a new Orthodox Catholic college in the mid-1970s, so we opened in 1977. If I said something else earlier, I misstated it, but we opened in 1977 after about a year of planning and preparation. In any case, anybody who was going to do that was going to be what we might call a dogmatic personality. People did not survive as Orthodox Catholics in those days unless they had dogmatic personalities, unless they enjoyed swimming upstream. The trouble with dogmatic personality is that we tend to be dogmatic about everything. We're very confident in our convictions, and whether those convictions are about the best way to educate people or the teachings of the church, or the best way to divide up authority in an academic institution, or the teachings of the church, or the best curriculum to have, or the teachings of the church, or the best way to organize student life, or the teachings of the church. We tend to be equally dogmatic about all of them. So it was a recipe for tremendous conflict. Not only that, although Warren Carroll had the wisdom to set up a board that he controlled, it was a 5-person board, in which he had his wife Anne and himself as 2 members, and me, who he absolutely trusted, as a 3rd member, which means that no matter what happened with the other 2, he was assured of 3 votes, a majority vote. We found out that if we wanted to grant degrees, the state of Virginia, which is where we started the college, would require, as all states did really, that we had a board of directors that was independent of the administration of the school. So that created a problem because Warren was going to be the president and I was going to be the director of academic affairs, a position that's now called vice president of academic affairs at Christendom. And so after a lot of soul searching, Warren set up a membership corporation, which you could be a member of. It was called the Christendom Educational Corporation, which you could be a member of if you took out a promissory note of at least $1,000. So anybody who invested $1,000 in the Christendom Educational Corporation had a promissory note, which means they could take it out, they could redeem it on demand. And it gave the college some funding, or gave the Christendom Educational Corporation some funding. And it enabled Warren to establish it as a membership organization, which he could control through the membership because, of course, the vast majority of people who knew about it and became members were A, people who lived at a distance, and B, people who knew about Warren Carroll and identified with his mission. And what happens in situations like that is that people are not the people doing the voting to elect the officers of the corporation are at enough of a distance so that what they know is that anybody who is opposed to the ideas, who's running for office of their guy, Warren Carroll, can't get enough votes, is very unlikely to get enough votes to succeed. So the Christendom Educational Corporation also then had the job of electing a board of trustees for the college. And the members of the board of the Christendom Educational Corporation were on this board of the college, and then a number of other members were on it too, so that the size of the board was such that the administration of the school, the 2 administrators who at the school, Warren and myself, who were on the board, could not control the board of trustees, at least not directly, although we'd have a lot of influence over it through, trying to encourage people in the membership organization to vote, certain ways. And that's how Christendom is very convoluted, but that's how Christendom keeps control over its mission to this day, so that the board of trustees, should it go bad, is not going to get away with changing, as so many boards of trustees have permitted at Catholic institutions over the years, not get away with changing the mission and the Catholic orthodoxy of the school. It's an unusual thing, but that's practical problem number 2 in every apostolic work. You need to have a way to make sure that the mission is not compromised based on who exercises control over the corporate entity that is in charge of the work. That's how Christendom did it.
So you were talking about people with dogmatic personalities earlier. So what were some of the conflicting ideas as far as not so much the Catholic orthodoxy aspect, but maybe the approach to how the school's culture should be formed? Are we doing academic formation versus moral formation, or both, or, how it should function on an educational level?
Yeah, I would say there were a couple of very interesting controversies, which I regarded as just a pain in the neck at the time because they all took time. But one was, should the school be a great book school, like Thomas Aquinas College had established itself as, or should it continue the way it was founded with a small number of majors? There was fierce debate both among the faculty and on the board over that, and for two reasons. One, because different people had different visions of what the ideal education is, but two, there was some thought that maybe a great books program would be less expensive to run than having to maintain, at the time, 5 different majors, all of which we had to be equipped to give degrees in. So that was one knockdown, drag-out fight among wonderfully good people with dogmatic personalities. And another related to the administration of the school, and in particularly, I guess you would say, Warren Carroll's personality, because Warren was a very unusual man, a very holy man, but he was not a man who, how should I put this? He was not someone who would have been regarded as sophisticated in the worldly sense. You know, the way he dressed, his directness in speech, how hard he worked, the way he cultivated potential donors with a very strong sense of mission, but not with all the other things that commonly go into cultivating the wealthy. That was polarizing to people who were concerned about the future of the college and were concerned about where the money was going to come from. So there was always rumbling about whether it would be better to have a president who tended to make a more worldly and sophisticated impression on the wealthy, rather than just instantly attracting people who were already ready to be sold on the dynamic mission of the college. That led to lots of jockeying on the board, lots of controversies, big and small, about how the college should be staffed, what direction it should go in with its fundraising, and ultimately, how long should Warren remain as president. So that was very painful often. It took a lot of time. Again, all good people trying to do what was best for the college. So those two were certainly major ones, and there were things that I suppose related to student life.
Yeah, I'm sort of curious about the student life question, because when I hear people debating about the culture and the campus of Christendom College, people are, they talk about the Christendom bubble. They talk about the idea that the school is supposed to form students morally as well as intellectually, and the idea that the school stands in loco parentis. But obviously there's a number of different, even if you agree with those concepts, there's a number of ways of interpreting, the school's obligation to form students morally as to, whether it should be its own little state, things like that. So were there any debates about that, or was that pretty much all unanimous as far as how the culture of the school campus should work?
I think there was more unanimity on that point than on many points. I would say that there was some concern about the isolation. In other words, just as a matter of intellectual development, I'd say that most of the faculty were aware that there is a drawback to the fact that students don't have the same opportunity as most of us had going to secular institutions for our higher education, of responding to the intellectual challenge of secular thinkers. They would learn, in the philosophy program and in the politics program about, certainly, and through history, they would learn about different ideas, but that's not the same thing as kind of being forced, being put in an environment where these ideas are being advocated all around you. So you're learning, at Christendom, you're learning what's wrong with certain ideas, but you're not getting exercised intellectually in the same way in having to formulate responses for yourself and to think perhaps more deeply than just getting a grade in a course. So I think there's always some concern about that. I don't think anybody could figure out a good way to solve that problem. Obviously, we weren't going to introduce faculty who were going to teach things that were contrary to what the church taught. So, and because it was a small school, there was only limited diversity on campus, both among the faculty and the students. So there wasn't. I mean, there were different groups on campus. There were some people who were very, very strict morally, and there are others who were much more relaxed morally. There were some people who just loved the highest liturgy possible, and there were people who would preferred their masses to be English, short and sweet. And there were people who loved the teachers who were the strongest as emphasizing the need to be properly formed in everything you do. Every activity you partake in should be a formative activity. And we had some who were like that, and others who were much more comfortable with people who could kind of relax and not think in terms, every time we had recreational activity, not think in terms of whether this activity was going to be kind of directly morally formative, as opposed to just people just relaxing and having fun. So there were some tensions along those lines, and I tend to be on the looser side of things like that. Obviously, the rules for campus behavior are going to be in keeping with Catholic morality, but in terms of whether people could have a dance and have the kind of music they liked with limits, or whether they had to dance to Gregorian chant or something like that, just to oversimplify on both sides. I tended to be on the looser side, so this was somewhat frustrating to me. But we were well able to waste a tremendous amount of time in endless controversy over every little thing, which is also a feature of small communities. Small communities often don't face the bigger questions that you face when you're in the big city or the big university. The peccadillos that we're aware of in the small communities might be very small potatoes, but there are peccadillos, and by God, we've got to do something about it. So that's a feature of small communities, and everybody knows what everybody else is doing. So there's a lot of chit-chat, a lot of talk, a lot of presumption that we know other people's motives and things like that. You had and still have, I'm sure, all those things at Christendom. But nonetheless, I think it was on the whole a wonderful place with fairly high academic quality, and it's turned out a lot of outstanding students and a lot of vocations as well.
Of course, it makes sense that, the school would have to foster some kind of spiritual environment because, going back to what you were saying about Charles Davis, if you're not praying, then none of it's going to hold together. So having a lot of public prayer on campus, for example, and would be very important. Daily mass timed so that anybody can attend no matter what their class schedule and things like that. So you were at Christendom from 1977 to 1985. Can you just go down the list of all the responsibilities that you had at Christendom?
Yes, I started out as a member of the board, of both boards actually, director of academic affairs, and a teacher. I was teaching partly in the theology department, teaching apologetics, partly in the history department, especially with a lower division course in Catholic art and culture, and then occasional upper division courses, although Warren Carroll did most of the history teaching. In addition to that, I had brought Faith and Reason. I had told Warren then when we started the college, I would make Faith and Reason the college's academic journal, the college take it over, but I was still editing that, and I was still in charge of what we called the Christendom Press. So we were publishing other books as well as the journal and selling them and trying to build up a mailing list that way. That was by far the fastest way to get names of potential donors. And it was something that, of course, I had wanted to do all along. And Warren was a writer of books, and he was committed that as well. So I did all those things. And then, unfortunately, and of course, as director of academic affairs, whenever we didn't have somebody to cover a course in the early earliest years, or in one case, when a political science professor that we had hired to teach the introductory political science course in this, I think it was the second year of the college, actually never showed up to teach, ended up getting into the cement business in some foreign country or something like that. It was a strange story.
Wow.
But in any case, I had to teach. I had to jump in to teach. I taught
were you teaching history already at that point? I mean, were you teaching history at the college from the get-go?
Yes, I did teach. The first year we had just freshmen and sophomores. I taught only the art and culture course, which was a historical art and culture course. Warren did the main required conventional history courses.
What were the other classes that you ended up?
When we added juniors, I started teaching some of the upper division history, like a history of the papacy and things like that. Also Renaissance and Reformation, I think I taught once. But anyway, yeah, I had to teach political science one year. I had to teach the English literature. I think it was the sophomore English literature course, required course. I had to teach, there was one more notable one. Oh, yeah. And there were a couple I've probably forgotten, but we had to let a Spanish teacher who was teaching an upper division Spanish course go in the middle of the year for reasons I won't go into. And so I had to take over that class, but I had to replan it it was a small class of very motivated students, of kind of student tutorials where each student was responsible for preparing a lesson and giving it and leading the discussion, because I didn't know Spanish. But we found a way to get the second half of the course done. So I was doing those things. And then unfortunately the college had a financial crisis in 1983 or 82, I think, where the funds held by the Catholic Educational Corporation were very badly invested by the person in charge of that, and they were lost. Not all of them, but I think about 60% of them were lost. And we thought we wouldn't survive. So I volunteered to take over fundraising because, of course, I had the mailing list from the press, and I figured that was going to be our only hope, in addition to what personal contacts Warren could continue to cultivate. And he did have some people who actually had some money and were donating. So I had to stop teaching for my last 2 years and do fundraising full time, along with all the other things. And by the end... Was
that annoying? I mean, did you not like doing that?
Oh, no, it was horrible. It was a penance from first to last.
Yeah.
I've always hated fundraising. The board was talking about closing the college down. And I was the logical person, because direct mail was a primary means of fundraising in the 1980s still. I mean, the internet hadn't taken over yet. So direct mail was another 10 years away. Direct mail was the outside of personal contacts. It was by far the bonanza area for fundraising. We had been selling a bunch of books and the journal since 1977, so maybe 6 years or something. We had I don't remember how big the list was, but we had thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, I'm not sure, sound Catholic people who bought Catholic things to read on that list. And clearly that was our only hope. So I just piped up in a board meeting one day and said, I'm going to have to do this, and I will do it. I'll do it for the next 2 years. I'll call every member of the Christendom Educational Corporation to make sure they understand the situation. For those I can't talk into leaving their investment intact until we can replenish the funds, we'll use what money we have to redeem their promissory notes, and we will fill that back up again, and the college will survive. I probably half the board didn't think that would be possible, but they were willing to give it a try. So I had to do that too, and I suppose that was probably too much for me. I mean, we got the job done, but I was, as we'll come to in a moment, I had tremendously overworked myself, and I was getting to the point in terms of how much I slept and how much work I was doing that my judgment was beginning to deteriorate. I was not as stable in the way I dealt with opposition as I had been before. It was clear, and I'm not saying that I don't know how many people noticed that I was struggling in various ways, but my closer friends certainly did. But point is that I could see that this was not good for me. I was doing something fundamentally wrong, and had been for a number of years in the way I approached apostolic work. And what was fundamentally wrong was my case, my instance of what I call the third type of problem that will always be faced in all apostolic work, and that's the personal problem. You have to know your blind spots. You have to find some way, whether it's spiritual direction or what it is, to recognize your blind spots, to recognize where you fall short in your trust in God and your ability to be led to a certain degree within the framework of the church, be led by the Holy Spirit rather than just pushing ahead always with your own ideas that you are sure are right. And if you only work hard enough, you can make them work, which was my tendency. My tendency was to be sure I was right and be sure and know that I could do anything if I just ramped up to a higher gear and did it. And my philosophy at the time and although that did some good, let's face it, that did some good, and we got through that crisis. And I was replaced by 3 people when I left, and that was the right thing to do. I mean, everybody had seen, first of all, that I was unusual, and secondly, that the consequences were not all good. So it was when I started recognizing that I had to think very deeply about what I was going to do going forward and how to do it, because my vocation was to be a husband and father, and my work in the apostolate had far outstripped in time and energy my vocation. That was the easiest way to recognize the problem, recognizing it not so much in psychological terms, but in very Catholic terms. And I remember, I don't know if you'll remember this, but it was 1984 oh no, you were born in 1990.
Well, I wasn't alive.
So you were not alive yet so you wouldn't remember it. Christopher might. So when Christopher was about 10, or maybe when he was 9, and we were up at the place in Lake Champlain where we used to go occasionally in the summer, I started the family rosary. Remarkably, we weren't doing that. And we were praying as a family, but remarkably, we were not praying the rosary every day, which seems inconceivable to me now. But then I hadn't had a thoroughly Catholic upbringing, so I was still learning what it meant to be a Catholic as well. And my intellectual approach to it was not the sum total of what Catholicism is. So I started that, one of the best Catholic decisions I ever made in our family. And we've been doing that ever since. But that grew out of this sense of what I call needing to understand the personal problem for anybody in the apostolate. How is my discernment? What is standing between me and really being sensitive to what God wants day to day, rather than just what he wants? What is good? What I know is good in theory. What is good in this situation? And for that, you need a very strong prayer life and constant introspection, and usually outside advisors, to be sure.
The family rosary every night was just something I took for granted growing up, and it never even occurred to me to ask, when or why we started. But so how did you get to the rosary in particular? How did you come to realize that was the thing to do?
Well, it was said on campus a lot, and I said it sometimes on campus. And I'm sure I knew of Father Peyton and the family that prays together stays together, which was a slogan that was built primarily around the rosary. I'm sure I knew that. But this is all in the context of me thinking that what I was supposed to do was knock myself out from, 8 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock at night in apostolic work, come home sometimes on time for dinner, spend time with my kids in the evening, and also on weekends when something wasn't super pressing that I had to attend to. And then after the kids were in bed, go back to work till 2 or 3 in the morning. So, people who are doing that don't necessarily think that it's time to institute the family rosary because they're so preoccupied with a faulty view of themselves and of the apostolate. I mean, I literally thought of myself as kind of a Catholic machine. I didn't deliberately try to neglect my family. I more neglected sleep, which was another part of the problem. Yeah, I thought I just needed to change gears and work harder and, the brute force approach, and we could get this done. But I had to realize that this was not, eventually I realized this wasn't healthy. Although it lasted, a lot of the problems were solved when I changed jobs, but it lasted a while, even in my Trinity years, because that, again, was starting a new enterprise. And of course, that's never easy.
Just because we're mostly talking about your work in this interview, but I just want to talk a little bit more about the rosary. I mean, how important did that become as a family thing? I mean, I know it was very important, but what results have you seen from that over the years, and where do you put that in the grand scheme of our Catholic life as a family?
Through faith, I believe that Mary's intercession is extraordinarily powerful, and that commitment to the rosary says something about your willingness to take time and get into something that on the surface seems boring, and to do it only for positive spiritual motives. So I think that's transformative. Both things are transformative. And the habit of prayer, no matter what prayer it is, if it's extended a little bit, is also transformative. I certainly would expect, and of course from that time forward, we were praying much more with the family and much more for the family. I always prayed for my children and my wife, and she also, but the family rosary has a way of focusing you on the family and the family's needs. It also can be very entertaining when the kids are little, and somewhat frustrating when they're in that intermediate age where they really want to secretly read a comic book or something. But yeah, I think it probably was critical. I mean, as of now, and not everybody who does this has the same result, but as of now, both my wife, Barbara, your mom, and myself, and all of our children are deeply committed Catholics. And those with children are trying to raise deeply committed Catholic families. I shudder to think how close I perhaps came to disrupting Catholic family life sufficiently so that there could have been some major breakdowns, but by the grace of God and by a modicum of good sense that it didn't get that far. I think is probably critical. And I mean, there are different things that you could do, but it's one of the best ways, perhaps the best way outside of Mass.
Okay, so you left Christendom basically because it was just the workload was becoming intolerable? Is that it?
Yeah, there are a combination of things. At one time I thought I might take over the presidency, that for a variety of good reasons, actually, now that I know myself better. Would not have been a good choice, good decision. I was pretty much separated from the students, having worked 2 years without teaching a class. So I didn't have that close relationship with the students anymore, which would have been one of the things that would have really made me want to stay. And the problem with publishing, the Christendom Press, was to a degree, although they tried to keep it up after I left, it was to a degree a thorn in the side of the college. At that stage, it was still doing a lot of good because of the mailing list and the fundraising and whatever good it did for those who read the books. But there were always some who thought, it's a distraction. We should just be a college. And they had certainly some good arguments on their side, too. Now, whatever, the Faith and Reason is now dead. But it lasted, 10 years or something after I left. And whatever books Christendom still publishes is under its own printer, really done through the Internet and Intercollegiate Studies Institute. So, whereas it was all done in-house before. And I really was drawn to publishing. And so I decided, well, I guess the way everything is shaping up, I am going to start a publishing company. I need something that is easy to control so I don't have to be fighting battles all the time, internal battles. I need something that where I know quite a bit about every aspect of it, which I already did, that can be done on with relatively low funding because of the advent of desktop publishing, which I was well acquainted with. So you didn't need a multi-$1,000 piece of equipment, which is what we had been using for the Christendom Press, to typeset books anymore. And, that I loved, if I haven't mentioned that. And I do love publishing, as is probably obvious. So I decided, I'm going to start a new nonprofit called Trinity Communications, and we're going to publish books.
This week's excerpt is not really relevant to, although I suppose you could connect it somehow to what my dad was saying about the cult of expertise. This is a passage by Noam Chomsky, oddly enough. It's from his early book called American Power and the New Mandarins. And I have not read the book that this quote is from, so I'm not recommending it necessarily. But I came across this quote, and it's a really great one. He's criticizing the modern belief that technocracy is more enlightened than rule by aristocrats or nobles. Quite generally, what grounds are there for supposing that those whose claim to power is based on knowledge and technique will be more benign in their exercise of power than those whose claim is based on wealth or aristocratic origin? On the contrary, one might expect the new Mandarin to be dangerously arrogant, aggressive, and incapable of adjusting to failure as compared with his predecessor, whose claim to power was not diminished by honesty as to the limitations of his knowledge, lack of work to do, or demonstrable mistakes. All right, thank you for listening as always. If you like the show, please give us a rating and review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. Also, it's been a while since I mentioned you can donate to us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Catholic Culture Podcast. And if you give as little as $1 per month, not only will you be in my daily prayers along with your family, but you will get the entire Catholic Culture Podcast soundtrack. All right, that's it for this week. Next week will be, depending on how my schedule pans out, either part 2 of this interview with Jeff Mirus, or it will be an interview with the Dominican friar Father Basil Cole about the moral and psychological effects of music viewed through a theological lens. Regardless of the order, those should be the next 2 episodes. All right, God bless you, and I'll see you next week.